I made Breaking Bad for the Nintendo DS. There's even local multiplayer too, so you can play as Jesse. Why? I don't know, 'cause it's funny I guess. How? Well, in this video I'll walk you through how I put Walter White on everyone's favourite dual screen handheld. So get ready to learn how to cook some homebrew, or in this case, lab brew. Let's jump straight into things. Homebrew Nintendo DS development revolves around a few key concepts. The C, or C++ in this case, language, the DevKit ARM project by the DevKit Pro people, the low-level libNDS homebrew SDK, and a whole bunch of awesome community libraries that interface with libNDS. As someone with a background in writing Minecraft Java plugins and all things, diving into the literal C was like having an ice bath while being electrocuted. Thankfully C++ did help me out by abstracting some of C's more low-level concepts into more familiar territory, such as classes. This didn't fully stop me from learning the hard way, exactly what a pointer was though. While I struggled learning C, I also took a look at the hardware. The DS packs 2 microprocessors, an ARM7 and an ARM9 chip. The dual chip design both allows for backwards compatibility with GBA games and enables some co-processing. It's the ARM9 chip that allows for 3D graphics rendering, the power and limitations of which gives games of the time their distinct look that I personally love. Unlike the Nintendo 64 before it, the ARM9 isn't capable of texture filtering, at least not to the same extent. This means polygons are drawn to the nearest pixels on the screen and there's no aliasing whatsoever. The flip side to this is that also unlike the Nintendo 64, the DS actually has a reasonable amount of VRAM, and this allows for detailed textures to be placed in environments. The result, combined with the DS's charmingly tiny 256 by 192 pixel screen, are clearly blocky but distinctly crisp environments, rich with texture. Supporting the 3D graphics engine being rendered to the main screen is the DS's various 2D modes, and Modern Vintage Gamer MVG did a great video in all these various modes, so I won't bore you with all the details, but in essence the system allows sets of bitmap or tiled backgrounds and bitmap sprites to be drawn to the screen, albeit with a few caveats. Last summer, some of you may remember my work to create Better Call Saul for the DS. This was a project for which the title screen probably provides more entertainment value than the game itself, but it was a library known as NightFoxLib I learnt to put that game together. For Breaking Bad this summer, I wanted to make something a little more
empire business.
Last summer, my experience writing Saul was bogged down having to scroll through ancient forum websites that Time and Google's SEO has largely forgot. So, when I dipped my foot into researching the DS homebrew scene this summer, and discovered a number of libraries had finally been moved to GitHub with full sets of documentation accompanying them, I was overjoyed. And that's not all. This is when I stumbled across Nitro Engine by Antonio ND, a library that enabled full 3D graphics support, including the loading and manipulation of both static as well as animated models through a bespoke format. With the stars aligning, I seized upon the meme potential and began work. First step was to model the lab. Going into this, I knew the sort of game I wanted to make, one which the player was tasked with navigating the lab under a time limit to complete a cook. The process of doing so would be in the form of minigame challenges the player would need to complete as they explored the lab. Using pictures from the show as reference, I decided to take some creative liberty with the layout of the Super Lab, both with the DS's polygon rendering limitations and the fact that people are actually going to have to play this in mind. Later I decided that to keep the controls simple and make it obvious where the player had to go next, it would be easier to have the lab be a fixed tile grid rather than have full 3D movement. To actually model the lab, I used Blender, a software I had extremely limited experience with really. I settled for building out the lab with basic geometry such as cuboids and planes and adding detail through the textures, which I had slightly more freedom with thanks to the DS's aforementioned relatively generous 512 kilobytes of VRAM. Next I needed a design for Walter. Remember the scene in Breaking Bad where they carry out a train heist for 9,000 gallons of methylamine? Yeah, well that made me think of Zelda Spirit Tracks on the DS, which also made me think of Toon Link, which reminded me of another unique bit of the hardware acceleration offered by the DS. Toon style shading and model outlining. This gave me the idea to go for a chibi aesthetic for Walter, which I figured would pop a bit better on the low-res DS screen. Walter White has never looked this cute before. To make this, I downloaded a Creative Commons licensed chibi model from Sketchfab created by XN Drive, and began texturing and UV mapping a chibi Walter's face onto it. I later redid the textures a few times and kept tweaking the shading settings throughout development. The result is, well, this! I also made some textures for Jessie, which is used in the local wireless multiplayer mode, but more on that in a bit. I'd also love to imagine what Gus or Mike would look like in this art style too, to be honest. Although I had the model for Walter in the game real early on, the process of getting him to animate correctly spanned the entire development cycle. The excellent Nitro Engine library supports importing rigged MD5 models and some animations into a special DSM format, which stands for DS Model. However, due to the DS's CPU, there's some pretty strict limitations on what are known as vertex group weights when it comes to animating models. Allow me to briefly explain. 3D models in games consist of a bunch of triangular and quadric faces, which you can think of as 3 or 4 dots in a 3D space connected together to form a face. A texture is then applied to the faces of a model to make it look nice. We can then draw the model somewhere in our scene and move the whole thing to give her a sense of motion. But to really sell the effect of walking, we need to independently move different triangles within the model itself. Or in other words, we need to tell the game to move specific groups of vertices around relative to the model itself. To aid this concept, we use bones to move different parts of the model around. To get Walter's head to bob from side to side, I set his neck bone to move left and right during his animation cycle. Bones are associated with a group of vertices on the model's mesh itself. In the case of Walter's head bone, it's grouped with all the vertices in his noggin. Bones also affect subsequent connected bones, so for instance, moving Walter's upper leg bone will also affect his lower leg bone, and all the faces and vertices connected to his lower leg. You may ask, if I'm a vertex and a nearby bone that I'm grouped with is being moved, how do I know exactly how much I should move relative to the movement of that bone? And the answer to that comes in the form of vertex weights. Each vertex entry in a group has an associated weight which tells the engine how much the movement of a bone should influence the current position of that vertex. Anyway, now knowing all this, what exactly was the challenge? Well, processing 3D animations is a fairly processor-intensive task, particularly when it comes to the mathematical operations of calculating vertex movement based on weight influence. To ensure the DS can handle it, Nitro Engine has 2 limitations in place. First, vertices can only belong to one vertex group, and second, the sum of weights in a vertex group can only add up to 1. Now Blender, being something I'm not really familiar with at all, and being designed for more modern modeling tasks, made figuring out how to get my model and animations to meet these requirements kinda tricky. But we did eventually get there. To help me with animation and rigging, I used Mixamo on the advice of Ermelbur, which proved incredibly useful in saving me a bunch of time animating Walt by hand. I then manually exported it to the MD5 format from Blender using a special plugin, and yeah. And here you can see the result of all my modeling efforts. You may notice one detail in the northeastern corner of the lab model. I added a little camera that tracks the player. I figured the scene could do with just a few more moving elements to keep things visually interesting. Plus, I also do like to imagine the actual perspective of the game is from a camera, and that the game is played sort of in like the second person as Gus watches over Walt hard at work from the back of old Los Pollos Hermanos. Later on I also added this pipe, which ties into the mixing minigame, and actually moves in sync as you move the pipe on the bottom screen in that minigame. I also made it so if you walk behind the mixing apparatus here, it'll go translucent, so you don't just lose track of the player when you stand back there. Okay, time to talk about the title screen. I mentioned that my Soul game's title screen was its best feature. While I'm not quite sure this beats the pulsating Soul face, I do like how the basic 3D model of the logo I did adds a bit of depth and perspective to it. Moving down to the bottom screen now, and this is where I used NightFoxLib to render bitmap 2D graphics to form the menus and minigames. I designed the backgrounds in Photoshop and packed sprites horizontally to more efficiently and easily load them into RAM and then into VRAM, selecting which sprite I wanted to render using NightFoxLib's animation frame system. Although the DS does have more VRAM than the N64, there's not exactly an unlimited supply of the stuff, so I had to get a little creative to fit everything in. For the menu system, I originally had it so each button was represented with two sprites, a regular button and a highlighted version of that button. But when I needed to add even more buttons to my game menu, I quickly ran out of room in the sprite sheet. I also wasn't happy with how blurry the buttons were looking, as I was scaling them up 2 times from being 64 by 64 pixel sprites. The code was getting out of hand as I kept adding more sub-menus, so I rewrote the system to allow me to define and draw specifically mapped out menu layouts with separate buttons and text drawn to them in different positions and combinations based on the player's current menu state. To fix the blurriness issue, I made use of the DS's horizontal and vertical sprite flipping function through NightFoxLib to make buttons not just one sprite, but actually 4 copies of the same quarter of a button, rotated to make the button appear as a whole. When the player taps the button, it simply changes out the animation frame of all 4 button sprites to a selected version, and keeps their current position and rotation. This is where the job fell to design 6 minigames that the player would need to complete to cook a batch. This is when I had the idea to add a purity system, where the amount produced by each batch would depend on how well the player performed at each minigame, with bad results causing the player to take a hit on the purity meter. With this idea in mind, I sketched up a list of 6 minigames, based on watching clips of the montages from the show and with the layout of the lab I came up with in mind. First, we need to turn the valve that activates the lab's ventilation system. Next, you'll head to the pestle and mortar to grind up some solute for dissolving. Then, you'll head to the industrial plant machinery in the center, where you'll need to crank the insulated pipes into position to allow for the chemical mixing to take place. As mentioned, the pipe in the 3D scene also moves. After that, you'll need to carefully pipette some reagent into an array of test tubes to start the chemical reaction. Then you'll pour the product into batch trays ready for proving, carefully filling the solution up to the line. Finally comes cracking the hardened product into crystals ready for dispatch via Gus's distribution network. Quick note here, I am definitely not a scientist. This definitely isn't a chemically accurate way of producing methamphetamine, which is probably a good thing, I think. Although they used to sell those digital cheap celebrity cookbooks for the DS back in the day, so maybe there's still a gap in the market for a true cooking papa. I also designed a brief tutorial just to give players a heads up on exactly what to do for each minigame. Naturally, the ever-eager Gale takes charge in the tutorial and walks you through all the minigames and mechanics. What a nice character. I'm sure nothing bad will happen to him, right? Okay, time to talk about sound. I hate sound. The homebrew libraries I use support both playback of raw sound effects and mod files. The former is, well, raw, uncompressed sound waves, and the latter being MIDI-like tracks with embedded samples. Unfortunately, while I can manage my way around Blender, Photoshop, and C pointers just about, I definitely can't do sound design or soundtrack production, so for this project I stuck with using raw samples converted from free sound files for both sound effects and music, a decision that came to haunt me later on as I had to write my own audio routine to cut up raw music files, which led to me inevitably beginning to randomly crash due to running out of DS memory as I added more and more sound effects. The game though, I went with some ambient music for the lab, as I figured building the atmosphere was a better choice for that setting than an annoying catchy tune. That doesn't mean there's no proper music though. When the player runs out of time, I added a special cutscene and slightly modified the routine I wrote for drawing the player's shadow.
Goodbye, Walter.
I don't think I could make a Breaking Bad game and have this not be the death animation. Incidentally, the "Goodbye, Walter" sound effect is also partially reused from my Soul game last summer. Speaking of special effects, does anyone remember the DS Rumble Pack? This lesser known cousin of the famous N64 pack was used in a handful of DS games to add a bit of extra flair, and most were inserted into the GBA slot too. I got my Rumble pack with a copy of Action Leap, but this thing came bundled with a whole bunch of titles depending on your region. I noticed that LibNDS had built-in support for the Rumble pack for whatever reason, figured this was neat, and yeah, I added it as a feature. There's also a button to test that it's working in the main menu. It'll rumble when you turn valves, crank, use the pestle, etc. Just a fun little extra I added. Okay, it's finally time to talk about multiplayer. While I was working on this game, I was curiously browsing around and thought it'd be real funny if the game could support multiplayer with a second player playing as Jesse. The sole reason that I had that "you can no longer play as Luigi" Super Mario Galaxy meme stuck in my head, and I thought it was drop dead hilarious if that was a thing in this game. While I didn't add exactly that meme into the game, I did stumble upon the amazing work of Funity, a member of the scene who's worked on all sorts of interesting homebrew projects, from Flappy Bird to multiplayer Counter-Strike, and it's this multiplayer work that really intrigued me. The DS was the first generation of Nintendo's multiplayer feature set, and it comes with a pair of multiplayer modes that were the grandfather of popular features in the Switch today: local and online multiplayer. Given that Nintendo's Wi-Fi connection is shut down, it's tricky to even connect a real DS to modern Wi-Fi access points, plus Nintendo put out a public request begging people to stop using those insecure USB dongles they used to sell. So I decided to set my sights on the DS's local multiplayer capabilities, known as Ni-Fi. This is a hardware-software feature that allows for local peer-to-peer system communications, and is also what allows the DS download play feature in retail games to work. That's when I stumbled across a template scaffold for supporting Ni-Fi and Homebrew created by Funity. After about a day of tinkering with integrating this template into my game, I finally got it working and can present my favourite feature of Breaking Bad for the DS: multiplayer support. With 2 DS systems, or 2 instances of the Melon DS emulator running locally, you can play with a friend. For the multiplayer mode, I used the aforementioned Jesse model. I also changed up the bottom screen heads-up display a little so the quota counters have been changed to score counters, and I added some outlines to more clearly represent who is who on screen. Aside from that, gameplay is pretty much the same as the single player mode. Aside from some fairly rudimentary netcode to sync the 2 systems locally, this wasn't actually a whole ton of work to add. It's a whole lot more fun to play though. I've made quite possibly the world's most involved party trick, requiring 2 DS systems, 2 flashcards, and I guess even 2 Rumble packs if you really want the full experience. Alright, time for a break. Hank Schrader. Great character. Possibly my favourite in the show actually. I wanted to add him to the game and figured what better way to reward the player from playing than giving out achievements, in the form of Hank's famous mineral collection. As you complete various objectives, you'll unlock minerals which you can view in this fun little screen added to the main menu. Being limited with VRAM, the way this works is a little cheaty. The background layer image here actually has all the sprites of the minerals baked into it, and over top the image I'm just adding simple question mark block sprites to cover it up. This saved me from having to spend a bunch of RAM adding individual sprites for each type of mineral, which gave me a tiny bit of room to add Hank's closed eyes to the HUD textures to give him a simple blink cycle in the menu. Kinda creepy actually the more you stare at it. With our tutorial done, both our 6 minigames and Hank's minerals added, plus multiplayer versus in the game, it was time to add in the main event, a story mode campaign. For the tutorial I added earlier, I added a simple dialogue system to let me show a character sprite talking with some text on screen. The text uses Nightfox's bitmap text drawing system, which draws text onto a special grid using a tiled background layer. It's pretty convenient and saves me the work of writing my own text drawing routine. To get this looking nice, I did some more trickery with sprites and backgrounds. Here's what a character sprite looks like in Photoshop. As you can see, it has 2 main sections, the eyes/air and the mouth/body part. The eyes have 2 states, blinking and not blinking, while the mouth has a few different frames to convey talking. 1 eye/hair sprite and 1 mouth/body sprite is drawn on the screen to complete the look, with the animation frame for both changing independently. The final part of the effect is that the background bitmap itself actually has both the HUD and lower torso of the characters baked into it, since we can't do translucent sprites in the DS's 2D mode. These chibi Breaking Bad sprites were excellently drawn for me by Garden Owl, so thank you very much and go follow him on Instagram. Story mode takes place over 5 days, there's a bit of dialogue at the start of each day. Between the days, I also added a shop where you can buy power-ups with your earnings from the day. And who better a shopkeep than Saul Goodman, of course. He'll sell you some stuff ranging from a pestle upgrade to a movement speed upgrade in the form of some Air Jordans, naturally. You can kinda tell the shop was a late edition though, as it is just a static background with some text drawn over it. I still think it looks alright though, and the music is just perfect in my opinion. After that, I added a super simple day clear cutscene that plays when you beat a level. And finally came adding the ending. For this, I decided to not add just one, but actually 2 endings. I won't spoil what they are, but the good ending might just require Saul and a few $1,000s worth of explosives. So, good luck. And with that, that is Breaking Bad for the Nintendo DS. This project exhausted me. But I can't lie, every time I see that title screen it brings a smile to my face. I think the thing that makes these real fake licensed games memes so good is just the dissonance there used to be between these acclaimed TV shows and films of the 2000s and these like cheap direct-to-bargain bin game adaptations that often look like they were just slapped together in a few days. You know what, I do kind of miss it. For every Bolt or Ben 10, there was an over-the-hedge DS, which pushes the system to near its limits with this absurdly dedicated dual 3D scene rendering tech. Or there's Wall-E for PS2 and PC. It was actually the first game I ever played, and I loved it. The developers of Wall-E, Asobo Studios, later went on to make the fantastic Microsoft Flight Simulator. They stopped really making all these licensed games around the turn of the 2010s, at least in the West. It's still going on in Japan. Instead, a lot of these companies went on to focus on making mobile games, at least until that stopped being profitable. Nowadays, since the closure of Disney Interactive, these type of things have just been basically relegated to Fortnite or gacha game crossover events, which kind of sucks. Like, sure, a lot of the stuff that came out was just shovelware. There's also a ton of just really interesting ideas. Who doesn't watch Wall-E and wonder how he would handle in like a platform game? Still, the magic of homebrew does mean that we can recapture just a little bit of the magic of that period, at least until the one who knocks arrives at the door. Better get a lawyer.